Welcome to Praise, Prayer and Preaching with the Reverend Dr. Keith Garner, Superintendent and CEO of Wesley Mission.
There is discussion around the world about the Christian calendar. This mainly centres around the fixing of Easter as a date. This is, of course, is something that takes different parts of the world, the Eastern Church and the Western Church, as being something very important. And, of course, it may well happen. I suspect it won't happen in my lifetime, and it may not happen in the lifetime of very many here. But it's interesting to think about the Christian year for many different reasons. I suspect, though that may take many decades, one thing that has changed is the passage that we're going to look at tonight from Matthew 17. In many lectionaries, those are the series of readings that the church follows, the Transfiguration actually appeared in Lent. And then certain churches in North America and Europe decided they would have Transfiguration Sunday, the Sunday prior to Lent. And so it changed its position. I actually think it's a good place for it before we enter Lent for lots of reasons. In a way, it is the bridge between what we call in the Christian calendar Epiphany. Epiphany simply is the season of glory. It begins at that time when the Magi visited, and the glory of God, as we read it in Isaiah 61 and elsewhere, the glory of God is certainly a light for those who would follow. It's a link between that season and the season that on Wednesday we're about to enter here in Australia and throughout much of the world when we come to Ash Wednesday and the beginning of Lent. The gospel narrative, Jesus Christ has announced he's going to Jerusalem. You've got to read chapter 16 to understand chapter 17. That's often the case. He's decided he's going to head for Jerusalem, that he's going to face suffering and even death. And all this follows the confession of Peter at Caesarea Philippi. Now, two things become apparent. First of all, Peter, who will become the leader of the earliest Christian church, is beginning to understand who Jesus is. Perhaps they all have an inkling. Perhaps Peter, more than any, begins to grasp something of who Jesus is. Still, it is a messianic secret. He's told to be quiet about it. The time will come, and even after this great momentous moment on the mountainside, they're told not to talk about it until after the resurrection. So there is something about that, albeit he is still on a journey of discovery. The second important thing is Jesus Christ is beginning to open up at a very deep and profound level something of what his glory means. And that leaves the disciples and others standing back. I was sharing with some people this week in a church of a totally different denomination how we wanted to discuss the word awesome. Everything seems to be awesome. That was an awesome cup of coffee. I don't think so. However, if there was one passage where that word might be absolutely appropriate, it would have to be this. It is awesome. It is that experience that this small group of disciples, the very inner circle Jesus has revealed himself to. We're given a clear indication that the course of his journey is set. He ascends a high mountain where he's clearly identified with God the Father. There are not too many occasions when we have the literary tool of linkages, but here is one of them. We're told 6 days afterwards. Whenever you read that in any kind of literature, you'd want to say, now why have we been told that? That tells us that what's gone before cannot be ignored, that somehow it is the basis upon which what we now read makes sense. And that linkage is made. What's obviously gone before is linked in a very real sense. And these are the words that we read. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. There he was transfigured before them. We know that Jesus is taking this inner group of disciples and ascends an unidentified mountain. Now, there's been much debate. Many scholars will talk about the debate, but I think we're fairly clear in our own mind now, even though that's changed probably in the last 100 years or so. Some of the earliest scholars and writers suggested it was Mount Tabor. The reason they might have suggested that was it's the nearer one to Nazareth. It's one they might have been there. But it's not really that high, isn't Mount Tabor? Mount Hermon seems to be the favourite choice, strengthened by the fact that it's not too far from Caesarea Philippi. And if you were to go there, and I've been there on a number of occasions, it very often had snow all year round on its peak. Why? Because it's 3,000 metres high. So it makes sense to call it a high mountain. You know, we all know the difference between a long walk and a short walk. We know the difference between a high mountain and a low mountain. This is a high mountain. And it's pregnant with meaning. Meaning for all those who would follow. It's tall enough to describe as high, and it's often snow-capped. Mountains, of course, are highly significant throughout the Bible. Mountains have a meaning, I think, in most cultures of one kind or another, but they are particularly meaningful when you take seriously biblical studies. You remember very early on, 22nd chapter of Genesis, we have Abraham and Isaac, that incident that happens on a mountainside. We have the giving of the law by Moses. We have the building of the temple, and so on and so on. And then when we turn to the Gospels, we see in Matthew's Gospel that we're now reading here, we know that there was a scene for one of the temptations. We know that when Jesus wanted to teach some of his most profound teachings, he was on a mountainside and sat down and taught the crowds. And of course, when he sent the disciples out, in the very last chapter of Matthew, it will be on a mountainside when he said, go into all the world and preach the gospel. So mountains are full of meaning. But on this mountain, Jesus is transfigured. While he was still speaking, a bright cloud covered them, enveloped them, it says in some translations. In some ways, I like that. And a voice from the clouds said, this is my son whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him. Jesus Christ shines with glory. Therefore it fits before Lent, doesn't it? That glory which has been constantly to be seen in him is now revealed in a most unique way. Transfigured before them. It's little wonder that this small group of disciples are frightened. It's little wonder because this is outside of their normal experience. The ministry of Jesus is confirmed by the appearance of Elijah and Moses. Elijah is considered in the minds of many of the people that would hear these words and would understand them, and certainly in the minds of that small group of disciples, the greatest of all the prophets. Of course, Moses is the one who God used to give the law. So when Jesus is pictured with them, he could not have been pictured in any way with any two greater people in the whole of the Old Testament. That's important in understanding that this again is some revelation as to who Jesus is. And from the clouds on the mountainside, God speaks. But clouds are important too. Remember, in the guiding of the people of God, there was a fire and a cloud that guided the children of Israel through their wanderings in the wilderness. And the experience fills them with mystery. Now, I think for those of us that have been brought up in a Protestant evangelical tradition, we're not always big on mystery. Oh, we're big on miracle, but not mystery. Now, I think this passage calls us all back to just stop and realize that there is such a thing as that which is inexplicable, that is outside of our experience, that brings us into the presence of God, and certainly belongs to the mystery of God. And here's a passage of that kind. If you're a young preacher and you'd never preached before, this wouldn't be the Sunday you'd like to start. Because it's so full of so many things in this passage. The voice from the cloud, called the daughter of the voice, is what is so important. Same words that you'll find in Matthew 3, chapter 3, verse 17, at the baptism. This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Repeat of the words in that mystical moment. The words take us beyond the prophet, Elijah and Moses. They're the words that point. And remember, the most important thing about that text is these words, listen to him. I love those words. Listen to him. Just listen to him. Not really dissimilar, you remember, from the first miracle in John's Gospel at Cana in Galilee when they ran out of wine and Mary, do whatever he says. That's the advice. Do whatever he says. Has its similarity here? Just listen to him. What he has to say to you is that which will transfigure our lives in the one that is changed before us. So we explore that thought together. First of all, what were they to listen for? It's one thing to say, just listen to him, but what were they to listen for? Remind ourselves that the confession of Peter is very much focused on Jesus Christ as the Messiah. And Jesus instructs the disciples, and particularly to Peter, don't reveal this to anybody else. There's no avoiding the fact that Peter and James share powerful rebukes in chapter 16. Peter, you remember, took Jesus aside. Jesus didn't take Peter aside, he just looked him down. Get behind me. It's a very powerful moment, actually. Michael Green even goes as far as to say there's a battle going on in these moments. This makes sense, I think, when we understand what was happening in the life. Can you imagine what this would have been like for the people in the early church to have heard this for the first time? Of course, the advantage they would have had is they would have had Peter, James, and John, and they would have said yes. And Peter, the first epistle of Peter, or first or second epistle of Peter, refers to that experience on the mountainside. There's something quite different than any other experience granted to the disciples in this moment. Some people have even gone as far as to say it's actually an experience after the resurrection read back into the gospel. I think that's not really going to work for me. Because I think it has so much to say and empower the disciples on the journey that lies afterwards. There is no way Matthew understands it, and it's in all the gospels in one form or another. And it brings us to something very, very important. Because there are different ways of listening. There's not just the listening for an audible voice. There's the listening to what he is about. In the context of hearing a voice in the mystery of this experience, they're encouraged to listen to Jesus Christ. And that means his words. But it means so much more. The account of the Transfiguration continues Matthew's great theme of the sonship of Jesus Christ. The sonship of God. The one who is Son of God and Son of Man. What sonship really means. So we can understand this incident, I think, this happening, from two perspectives. First of all, we can understand it in relation to a great affirmation of who Jesus Christ is. Listen to him. As you listen, you'll discover who he is. We can listen to it from another perspective, as this way in which God is revealing himself to disciples, so that in quite a unique way they can grasp it. These disciples are going to have to face chaos. They're going to have to face the isolation that comes with leadership. These disciples are going to, at a point in time, are going to be on their own. They're going to be out there where it really counts. And they must listen now very carefully to hear God's voice. The voice that will sustain them, the voice that will inspire them, the voice that will sustain them through the most difficult of experiences. The disciples are not being encouraged to believe an amazing experience is going to be their everyday experience. Peter, James, and John. Peter, whose life perhaps was given over in sacrifice for Christ, is perhaps never going to have an experience like this ever again. Yes, it's true to say that by the lake in the Galilee, when he goes up there and he's fishing, and he certainly meets the risen Christ. But this is a unique moment for these three disciples, that perhaps is giving them the power to be able to be the leaders that they're going to be when they know the Lord Jesus has died for them and been raised to the new life. So what were they to listen for? To listen for his voice? To listen to his purpose? Secondly, what does it say to us? Now, I think it's okay for us to talk about what it meant for the disciples, but what does it do as it kind of trundles down the years to where we are today? Matthew's purpose in the passage seems to be focused on how the disciples handle the experience. Jesus is preparing them for the future and all that will mean. The voice of God from the clouds gives an ideal public endorsement, and we're told that they fell face down. They fell forwards. This is not being pushed over by somebody in some religious high moment. They fell forwards. Prostrate before him because of the power of this experience that is given to them. There's no degree of calmness about it because they're frightened. And it's very interesting that I think we talk about mystery, fear is found in mystery. And I think throughout the Christian tradition we have made people frightened of so many things. The church has been big on making people feel frightened about how they live, the fear of the preachers, the priests, and the leaders. No, this is not a fear of that kind. This is a fear that they are in the presence of a holy God. This is a holy moment in the Gospels. And they fell on the ground. And we're told, if you remember reading the passage, that when they got up, there was only Jesus. The prophet isn't there. Moses isn't there anymore. Only Jesus in this moment of great fear. It's Mark who talks about the building of booths, and here we have capturing the moment. You know, there was a festival of booths within the Jewish tradition. Some people have tried to relate it to that, and they want to keep the moment. Who wouldn't? If you had a mystical experience of this kind, wouldn't you want to keep it? Wouldn't you want to stay with it? Wouldn't you want to say, when we go down there, nobody will believe us? So we want to keep it. But you can't keep it. You can't keep it. But they will never forget it. I think there's a powerful message in this account that reminds us, however attractive, we cannot cling to our mountaintop experiences. But we can let them give shape to how we shall live. To what kind of message? If we listen to his voice, if we just listen to him, his voice will be enough. A deepening faith should always lead us to a stronger place of compassion. When Jesus and the three disciples were engaged in a mountaintop experience, what we're told was happening at base camp was the rest of the disciples were struggling with a father and a child, a young person possibly, in a very difficult experience, struggling with it. It's actually different in a number of accounts because others say that they all struggle when they get down to face it. The reality is that you can't run away from the things you have to face in life. And a deepening faith should always lead us to a place where we're ready to face whatever it is that's there. I've always found it helpful to look at the two passages. It's actually a demon-possessed boy in this passage here. Always interesting to try to hold them together and say, these things are not really meant to be separate. In Matthew, the whole experience seems to be described as a vision. R.T. France wrote this: we cannot and need not know what a cine camera on the mountain would have recorded. In the experience of the disciples, heaven has invaded the earth and the superhuman glory of the Messiah has been revealed. Oh gosh, I wish they had a camera many, many times. We might say that with resurrection too. I've been asked many questions about resurrection over the years. If only we had a camera there, what would we have seen? There is a futility about the question. because we cannot see. And what we have laid before us here is this amazing experience that changes these disciples' lives forever. So though we cannot see, they are different. I balance the thought of this glory that they experienced to the reality of what they had to return to. And I think it makes sense to those of us who spend our lives believing in the mystery and power of the good news of Jesus Christ and the harsh reality of people's pain and suffering and the cruelty of this world, that Scripture helps us to see they are so vitally linked here. The disciples have to go down and face the music. Jesus has to have a group of disciples who didn't always get it right. But I suppose there's a third question. It's this: what kind of listening is required? How many of us can remember? Now, you may never have had this experience, but I confess I remember it. Are you listening, Garner? School. Used to call you by a surname only, you know. The grammar school I went to. Dreadful, actually. Dreadful. But I knew what it was to not always be listening. So what kind of listening is required on our part? I don't think it's just something that you hear physically, audibly. It's something more than that. Are you listening so that whatever he asks of you, you're prepared to do it? I think that this passage reminds me of the importance of worship. There are some times in the Gospels when you're aware that the early church was a worshipping community, but you have to read behind it. You don't have to read very far in this to see that the early church was a worshipping community, where the presence of God was clearly important to them. And as the season of Lent is soon to be upon us, when we give ourselves to that whole emphasis of self-examination and repentance for the sake of the life of inner peace, we should take a look at ourselves with an integrity and honesty that is important. But the best way to begin to prepare to do that is in the presence of God. That's why I say, let's have this Sunday. When we think of a passage that if on the train tonight somebody says to you, what did they preach about in church tonight? You'll say, it was transfiguration. Then you'll be waiting for the next question. Whatever does that mean then? And then you'll be hoping your station's coming up soon, because all of us, preacher and hearer alike, know this has something of that which is a bit beyond all of us, fully grasping, but is so important. Metamorphosis, metamorphose, the word that we really relate to transfiguration. Metamorphosis, that complete change. You remember doing it? I remember doing it in biology. That's what they used to have before they did science. You know, we used to do chemistry, biology, physics. That's the old days. Anyway, when we did all those things, didn't we do that journey from the chrysalis to the beautiful butterfly? That complete and utter metamorphosis, that complete change. Jesus was transfigured before them. He was different than they saw him at any other time. And I spent my whole ministry trying to bring the gospel down to earth, and then I'm confronted with this passage. And I want to say, how earthy can I make this passage? Not really that earthy, because what happened for Peter and James and John was that Jesus was transfigured before them. But the purpose was very earthy. It was to go back and be the kind of women and men that they and we are meant to be as we recognize him. There are two other places in the New Testament where this word, this concept is used, and I share them both with you. We're familiar with them, I'm sure, when Paul is writing to the Romans, the most amazing treatise of the teaching of the Christian community. He writes, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. Be transformed. And then we read elsewhere in 2 Corinthians, and we all who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory are being transformed into his likeness with an ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. So I think now, when we move beyond the Gospels, this concept of transformation, which they have met in Jesus, now becomes something that they don't only observe in Jesus, but ought to be happening in our lives too. As we are changed from one degree of glory to the next. And time again, people have had those moments, don't they say, of the one who was the first martyr who held the coats, that his face shone like an angel. There was something that made him different. It's not every day. We're not going to, over a cup of tea tonight, all have that experience. But I think we'd be naughty to rub it out and say it never happens. There are those for whom that glory is there. Tom Long, the great distinguished writer on Christian preaching and theology, engaged in a study of worship with dozens of congregations, which eventually was published. And among his insights on worship, he said that faithful worship must be a mix of the mystical, transcendent moments combined with real contemporary engagement with issues, questions, problems, and concerns that are going on right now. I like that. A mix of the eternal and the real all together. And I say that's why we've got 17th chapter of Matthew tonight. Before we plough on until we think about temptations and we think of the struggle and we think of the conflict and all those things that invade our Lenten program quite rightly, before we do any of those things, we consider the glory of Jesus Christ. We need the high moments. We need the moments when together as a people we reflect on who Jesus Christ really is. And then we get to the car park and we have to find our way in life. The experience of transfiguration before the disciples and for all of us calls us to listen to God's voice. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Just listen to him. And let's do that on our journey this year.